Stand on the edge of the precipice with me for a moment. Close your eyes and feel the humidity clinging to your skin, heavy and thick, like a wet blanket that smells of river mud, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. It is not just a city. It is a living, breathing beast made of earth and ambition. You are looking up, straining your neck to see the summit of the great earthen mountain that claws at the sky, the place where the man they call the brother of the sun stands. He is not just a ruler to you. He is the reason the corn grows, and he is the reason your chest tightens every time the drums stop beating. Silence is not peace here. Silence is a threat. Imagine the terror of realizing that the very gods you worship demand something you cannot bear to give. It's that split second when the chanting of 20,000 people syncs with the pounding of your own heart, and you realize the crowd isn't looking at the priest anymore. They are looking at your son. The air leaves your lungs. The world narrows down to a single point of focus, the small, trembling hand gripping yours. You know with a certainty that freezes your marrow that the sun will not rise tomorrow unless the earth is fed, and today the earth looks hungry for something familiar. This is the moment the golden age turns into a cage. This is the moment you decide whether to kneel or to run, knowing that running means venturing into a wilderness that wants you dead just as much as the city does. But look closely at the tree line. Something is watching back. The Mississippi flows relentlessly, indifferent to the rise and fall of the great mound builders. But for Kian, the river was the only thing that made sense anymore. He wiped the limestone dust from his forehead, leaving a gray streak across his copper skin. From where he stood, on the lower terrace of his family's dwelling, the sprawl of Cahokia was a dizzying masterpiece of order and chaos. Rows of thatched houses stretched out like the ribs of a giant skeleton, bisected by the grand plazas where the game of chunky was played with violent fervor. To an outsider, this was the center of the world, the apex of civilization in the heart of the continent. To Kian, it was a delicate spiderweb, glistening and beautiful, waiting for the fly to thrash. He looked over his shoulder at Elu. She was grinding maize, the rhythmic sh-clack of the stone against stone acting as the heartbeat of their home. She didn't look up, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles turned white around the pestle. They didn't speak of it, the whisper that had rippled through the artisan's quarter like a cold wind. The harvest had been bountiful, yes, but the priests were saying the spirits were restless. The brother of the sun had not been seen atop the Monks Mound for 3 sunrises. When the ruler hides, the people tremble. Kian's eyes drifted to the corner of the room where their son, Talan, was sleeping. The boy was 12, on the cusp of manhood, with eyes that saw too much and a tongue that asked questions dangerous enough to get a man killed. Kian felt a fierce protective surge, a primal growl rising in his throat. They were just a family of pottery makers and shell carvers. They should have been invisible. But in a city of 20,000 souls, invisibility was a luxury that was rapidly becoming too expensive to afford. The morning sun shattered against the white clay plaster of the great mound, turning the city into a blinding expanse of light. Kian stepped out into the thoroughfare, the packed earth beneath his sandals vibrating with the footsteps of thousands. It was market day. The air was a cacophony of languages, traders from the far north with their copper, men from the humid south with shark teeth and shells, and the locals shouting the prices of dried venison and flint hose. Usually, Kian loved this. He loved the energy, the sheer magnitude of human ingenuity. He was a man who understood structure. He shaped clay into vessels that held water, life's most precious resource. He understood that walls held things up. But lately, the walls felt like they were closing in. He navigated the crowd, a basket of finished wares strapped to his back. His destination was the Grand Plaza, specifically the compound of the overseer of trade. As he walked, he couldn't help but notice the eyes of the people, usually bright with commerce. Today they darted nervously. A group of warriors, their bodies painted with the red ochre of authority and carrying heavy wooden clubs, pushed through the crowd. The people parted like water, heads bowed low. Kian bowed too, but he kept his eyes up, watching. They weren't patrolling, they were hunting. They moved with specific intent, heading toward the sector where the astronomers lived, the keepers of the woodhenge, the calendar poles. "Did you hear?" a voice whispered near his ear. Kian flinched, turning to see Geb, an old flint napper with hands scarred by a lifetime of chipping stone. Geb didn't look at him, pretending to inspect a gourd. "Hear what, Geb?" Kian murmured, feigning interest in the gourd. "The Morning Star pole. The shadow fell wrong yesterday. The alignment is broken." Kian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The woodhenge was the clock of the cosmos. If the alignment was broken, it meant the favor of the upper world was slipping. And when the favor slips, blood is required to grease the gears of the universe. "It's just the season shifting, Geb. Don't speak of such things." "It's not the season," Geb hissed, finally locking eyes with Kian. "It's the boy. The great sun has dreamed of a boy who speaks to the river." Kian's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Talan. His son spent hours by the riverbanks, collecting mussels and talking to the water, claiming the currents told him stories of the future. Kian had always dismissed it as childish imagination, a game. But in Cahokia, imagination that didn't serve the state was heresy. If the rumors of Talan's conversations had reached the upper mounds, Kian abruptly turned away from Geb, the basket on his back suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He needed to get home. The market, the trade, the pottery, none of it mattered. The instinct to protect was screaming in his ears, drowning out the noise of the plaza. He tried to move casually, to not look like a man fleeing, but the crowd seemed to thicken, impeding him. He was forced to stop near the edge of the chunky field. 2 warriors were clearing the space for a match, but the usual excitement was absent. The air was thick with a static charge. High above, on the flat summit of the largest mound, a figure emerged. Even from this distance, the feathered cape and the copper headdress caught the light. The crowd went instantly silent. It was a silence so profound, you could hear the wind rustling the dry corn stalks miles away. The figure raised a hand, not in blessing, but in a gesture that Kian recognized from the old stories, the sign of the winnowing, the separation of the grain from the chaff, the useful from the disposable. Kian pushed. He didn't care about politeness anymore. He shoved past a trader laden with furs, ignoring the man's indignant shout. He needed to see Elu. He needed to grab Talan. They had to leave. Now. The stories of the ancestors spoke of times when the leaders lost their way, when the hunger of the mounds could only be sated by the innocent. Cahokia was the greatest city the world had ever seen, a testament to human power, but power always demands a fuel source. Kian broke into a run as he reached the residential districts, his breath tearing at his throat. He turned the corner to his street, his eyes seeking the familiar thatch of his roof. What he saw stopped him dead. The door to his home was smashed inward. A clay pot, one he had shaped with his own hands just last week, lay shattered in the dust. And standing in the doorway, holding a piece of Talan's tunic, was one of the red-painted warriors. The warrior looked up, locking eyes with Kian. He didn't attack. He simply smiled, a cold, knowing expression that promised the end of the world. The warrior raised a finger to his lips, dropped the fabric, and pointed toward the great central plaza. The message was clear. We have them. Kian fell to his knees, the dust of the city he loved coating his tongue, tasting of ash. But as his hands hit the dirt, his fingers brushed against a sharp shard of the broken pottery. It cut him. The pain was sharp, real. It woke him up. He gripped the shard, tight enough to draw blood, tight enough to turn fear into fuel. He stood up. He wasn't a warrior. He was a maker. But today, he was going to unmake something. He turned back toward the great mound, not with the reverence of a subject, but with the calculation of a desperate father. The sun was high now, casting no shadows, exposing everything. There was nowhere to hide. Kian took the first step back toward the lion's den, but he paused as a sound drifted from the direction of the river, a low, mournful tone, like a horn blown from beneath the water. It was a sound that shouldn't exist. The warrior in the doorway heard it too, and his smile faltered. Kian looked at the river, then at the mound. The city was caught between the earth and the water was waking up. The sound from the river didn't just hang in the air, it vibrated in the teeth. It was a resonant, deep-bellied groan that felt less like a noise and more like the earth grinding its molars together. In that fraction of a second, the elite warrior standing in Kian's doorway flinched. It was a microscopic hesitation, a flicker of superstitious dread that cracked his mask of absolute authority. He looked toward the water, his grip on the wooden club slackening just enough to let gravity take over. That was all Kian needed. He didn't think. Thoughts are for men who have tomorrow, and Kian had just watched his tomorrow be dragged away. He launched himself forward, not with the grace of a fighter, but with the clumsy, explosive desperation of a father. The shard of pottery in his hand became an extension of his rage. He drove it into the gap between the warrior's copper breastplate and his neck. There was no cinematic clash of swords, no noble exchange of words. Just a wet, sickening thud and a gasp that bubbled with blood. Kian stood over him, chest heaving, his hands trembling so violently he almost dropped the shard. He looked at his own fingers, stained crimson. He had spent his life creating vessels to hold things, water, grain, seeds. Now he had broken a vessel. He had let the life spill out of a man. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, but he shoved it down into the darkest pit of his stomach. There would be time for guilt later, perhaps when he was dead. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the empty space in the room where Talan and Elu should have been. He grabbed the warrior's heavy war club, black walnut wood inset with razor-sharp flint, and stepped over the body. He didn't look back. The sanctity of his home was gone. It was just a structure of poles and thatch now. He moved into the alleyways, avoiding the main thoroughfares. The city of Cahokia was transforming around him. Usually the air smelled of roasting venison and wood smoke, a comforting domestic blanket. Now it smelled of ozone, and ozone meant storm, but the sky was clear. It was the smell of spiritual electricity. The drums had started up again, a low, rolling thunder from the Grand Plaza that seemed to dictate the rhythm of Kian's own blood. Boom, boom, boom. It was the heartbeat of the city, and it was beating too fast. As he navigated the narrow passages between the wattle and daub houses, Kian saw the fear etched on the faces of those hiding in the shadows. The ordinary people, the farmers, the weavers, the flint knappers, were not in the plazas. They were barring their doors. They knew what it meant when the great sun called for a purification. It meant the balance had tipped, and the scales needed to be weighted with souls. He reached the edge of the artisan district, where the ground began to slope upward toward the administrative centers. From here, the view opened up, and the terrifying scale of the situation became clear. The Grand Plaza was a sea of humanity, but it was a sea parted by fear. Thousands of people were pressed against the edges of the vast flat field, leaving the center open. And there, rising like a man-made mountain, was the Monks Mound. It was colossal, a testament to the sheer will of the Mississippian people, basket by basket of earth hauled to create a stairway to the sky. But today, it didn't look like a stairway. It looked like an altar. Kian crouched behind a granary, his eyes scanning the procession moving toward the base of the mound. His breath hitched. He saw them. They were small figures from this distance, stripped of their daily clothes and dressed in white deerskin, the color of the spirit world. Elu was walking with her head high, her posture rigid, refusing to give the priests the satisfaction of seeing her stumble. And Talan, Kian had to bite his knuckles to keep from screaming. Talan looked so small. The boy was looking around, not with fear, but with that same intense curiosity he had when he studied the river currents. He wasn't looking at the priests, he was looking at the sky, at the birds circling in agitated patterns. He seemed tuned into a frequency that no one else could hear. Kian gripped the war club. The distance between him and them was 1/4 of a mile of open ground, patrolled by the elite Birdman Guard. To cross it was suicide, but to stay here was a slower, more painful death. He needed a distraction, something bigger than a noise. He needed a catastrophe. He looked toward the river again. The water was behaving strangely. The Mississippi was a brown, muscular snake that usually flowed south with predictable indifference. But now the water near the banks was churning, frothing white. The fog he had noticed earlier wasn't just rising. It was crawling toward the city like a living carpet, thick and unnatural. It smelled of ancient decay, of things that had been buried in the mud for eons. The cosmology of his people spoke of the upper world of order and light, and the lower world of chaos and water. The great sun claimed to represent the upper world, but looking at the river, Kian realized the lower world was coming to collect its due. He made his move, not toward the plaza, but toward the perimeter stockade that bordered the ritual precinct. If he could climb the palisade, he could drop down behind the lesser mounds, flanking the procession. He reached the base of the great wooden wall, logs the size of telephone poles driven deep into the earth. It was insurmountable for most, but Kian knew timber. He knew where wood rotted first. He found a section where the drainage from the recent rains had softened the earth and weakened the base of the logs. Digging his fingers into the gaps, he scrambled up, splintering his nails, ignoring the tear in his shoulder muscle. He vaulted over the top and landed in a crouch on the other side. He was in the silent zone, the area reserved for the dead and the keepers of the dead. Here, the noise of the crowd was muffled, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. He moved toward the ridgetop mound, a long, coffin-shaped structure where the bones of the ancestors were cleaned and stored. He needed to cut across this sacred ground to get ahead of the procession. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the darkness of a charnel house and clamped over his mouth. Kian reacted on instinct, swinging the club, but the hand was stronger than iron. He was slammed back against the rough wood of the structure, the breath driven from his lungs. He stared up, expecting to see the painted face of a guard. Instead, he saw a mask. Not the copper bird masks of the elite, but a mask made of wood, carved to look like a grotesque twisting catfish, a creature of the lower world. The figure removed the hand from Kian's mouth, but kept a blade pressed against his ribs. "You run loudly for a man trying to cheat the gods," the figure whispered. The voice was rasping like dry leaves skittering on stone. "They have my son," Kian choked out, his hand tightening on his own weapon, ready to die if it meant taking this obstacle down. "The boy who speaks to the water," the figure said. It wasn't a question. "We know. Why do you think the river is angry? It is not angry because of the boy. It is angry because the Sun Brother is trying to steal what belongs to the depths." The figure stepped back into a sliver of light. It was a woman, old but corded with muscle, wearing the tattered grey robes of a banished order. The keepers of the shell, those who interpreted the chaotic whispers of the underworld, long ago driven out by the solar priests. She lowered her blade, but her eyes, visible through the slits of the catfish mask, were hard and assessing. "You cannot save him with a club, Potter," she hissed, glancing toward the great mound where the chanting had reached a fever pitch. "The Sun Priest has already started the binding. If Talan steps onto the summit, the connection is made. The boy becomes a conduit. He won't die. Worse, he will be hollowed out. His mind will become a vessel for the Sun Brothers' paranoia." Kian felt the blood drain from his face. "Tell me how to stop it." "You don't stop it from here," she said, turning toward the massive, flat-topped mound that dominated the skyline. "You think that mountain is solid earth? You think we piled dirt for 100 years just to stand closer to the clouds?" She laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The mound is a shell, Kian. It has a throat." She pointed to a patch of disturbed earth near the base of the Monks Mound, hidden behind a screen of woven mats. It looked like a drainage ditch, forgotten and overgrown. "There is a passage," she whispered, leaning in close, her wooden mask clicking against Kian's ear. "The priests use it to make their voices sound like thunder, but it leads to the center, to the heart of the mound. If you go in, you come up right beneath the feet of the Brother of the Sun." Kian looked at the dark, muddy hole. It looked like a grave. "Why help me?" he asked. The woman looked toward the encroaching river fog, which was now licking at the edge of the plaza. Because the sun has scorched us long enough. It is time for a flood. Kian didn't hesitate. He nodded to the woman and slid into the darkness of the tunnel. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp clay, the smell of his trade, the smell of his life. He crawled forward on his belly, the weight of millions of baskets of earth pressing down on him. But as he crawled, he heard something ahead. Not the chanting of the priests above, but a rhythmic scratching, like something large, buried deep within the mound, was trying to dig its way out to meet him. The darkness inside the Monks Mound was not empty. It was heavy, a physical substance that pressed against Kian's eyelids and filled his mouth with the taste of ancient dust. He was no longer a man crawling through a tunnel. He was a worm moving through the gut of a god. The air here was stale, recycled by the earth for decades, smelling of damp clay and something sweeter, something cloying like rotting magnolias. Every inch he dragged himself forward was a battle against the crushing claustrophobia that whispered he would die here, buried beneath the ambition of kings. He was a potter. He knew earth. He knew that clay remembered the hands that shaped it. As his palms slapped against the wet, slick floor of the tunnel, he felt the memory of the builders. He felt the millions of baskets of soil carried on the backs of men and women whose names were forgotten, compacted layer by layer to build this stairway to the sky. He was crawling over their spines. The scratching sound he had heard earlier grew louder, a frantic rhythmic scraping that echoed down the narrow shaft. It sounded like desperation. Kian paused, his heart hammering against the dirt floor. He was in the belly of the beast, and the beast was digesting. He forced himself to breathe, counting the beats as Elu had taught him when he would get too angry at a firing that went wrong. 1, 2, 3. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He wasn't just crawling, he was ascending. The tunnel had begun to slope sharply upward. He pushed forward, his shoulders burning, the cut from the pottery shard on his hand throbbing in time with his pulse. The tunnel widened slightly, opening into a small, timber-lined antechamber. Here the darkness was absolute, but the scratching stopped abruptly. Kian froze. He reached out into the void, his fingers brushing against rough wood, cedar posts, likely used to shore up the massive weight of the earth above. But then his hand touched something else, something cold. Bone. He recoiled, his breath hitching. He fumbled at his waist, finding the small pouch of dried moss and a flint striker he always carried for the kiln fires. It was a risk. Smoke rose, but he needed to see. He struck the flint. A spark hissed, then caught. The small flame illuminated the chamber, and Kian had to clamp his hand over his mouth to stifle a scream. The walls were not just supported by cedar. They were reinforced with ribs, human ribs. Femurs stacked like firewood, skulls embedded in the packed earth, facing inward, their hollow sockets staring at him. These weren't enemies. They were the foundation. The stories the elders whispered late at night, the ones about the great binding when the city was founded, were true. The mound wasn't just a platform for the living. It was a battery charged with the dead. Kian extinguished the light. The anger that had propelled him this far crystallized into something colder, sharper. He wasn't just saving his family anymore. He was going to tear this abomination down, even if he had to do it with his bare hands. He moved faster now, reckless in the dark. The slope became a ladder, rungs carved directly into the hard-packed clay. He climbed, the air growing thinner, hotter. He could hear the drums again, but now they were beneath him and around him, a vibration that shook his teeth. He was getting close to the summit. The tunnel was acting as a resonance chamber, amplifying the sounds from the surface. Then, he heard the voice. It wasn't the chanting of the crowd. It was a singular booming baritone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voice of the great sun. But heard from inside the mound, it sounded different. Stripped of the open air and the majesty of the plaza, it sounded tinny, strained. Kian reached the top of the ladder. Above him was a wooden grating, blocked by a heavy woven mat. Light filtered through the weave, blinding brilliant daylight. He was directly beneath the platform of the temple. He carefully pushed against the wood. It held fast. He pushed harder, putting his back into it, straining his legs against the clay rungs. The grating groaned. Above, the chanting faltered. The great sun's voice paused. Kian froze. Had they heard him? He waited, sweat stinging his eyes. "The spirits are restless," the great sun roared, improvising. "They demand the boy. Bring him to the edge." Kian shoved with everything he had. The wood splintered. The mat tore. He burst upward, coughing as dust swirled around him, emerging not onto the open plaza, but into the dim, smoky interior of the Temple of the Dead atop the mound. He scrambled out of the hole, rolling onto the floor, clutching the war club he had stolen. The temple was vast, smelling of burning sage and rotting flesh. Along the walls sat the desiccated bodies of past rulers, strapped to wooden thrones, adorned in pearls and copper. But Kian didn't look at the dead kings. He looked toward the massive open doorway that led to the terrace. The light pouring in was blinding, framing the silhouette of the great sun. He was a giant of a man, wearing a cape of iridescent turkey feathers and a headdress that scraped the top of the doorframe. He was facing the crowd, his back to Kian. Beyond him, Kian could see the vast expanse of the sky and the tops of the other mounds. And there, kneeling at the very edge of the precipice, outlined against the blue, was Talan. Elu was there too, held back by two warriors, her face a mask of silent screaming. But Talan was unbound. He was standing at the edge, his toes curling over the drop. He wasn't looking at the crowd below. He was looking at the river. Kian moved. He didn't run. He stalked. The noise of the crowd outside was deafening, a roar of 20,000 souls demanding salvation. It covered the sound of his footsteps on the temple floor. He raised the war club, targeting the back of the great sun's head. One swing. That was all it would take to end the lineage, to break the spell. He was 5 paces away. 4, 3. The great sun suddenly stiffened. He didn't turn around, but he raised his staff, silencing the crowd instantly. "The earth bleeds," the ruler whispered, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the mound. But this time, there was a tremor of genuine fear in it. Kian hesitated. The floor beneath his feet, the packed earth of the temple, rippled. It wasn't an earthquake. It was localized. The dead kings on their thrones rattled. The movement came from the hole Kian had just climbed out of. From the darkness of the tunnel, a sound erupted that shattered the sanctity of the moment. It wasn't the scratching, it was the roar of water. The Mississippi hadn't just risen, it had found the weakness in the foundation. The tunnel Kian had used, the throat of the mound, was connected to the water table, and the pressure had finally equalized. A geyser of brown, muddy water exploded from the hole in the temple floor, spraying the ceiling, drenching the dried corpses of the ancestors. The great sun spun around, his eyes wide, his painted face crumbling into shock. He saw Kian, a man covered in grave dirt, holding a war club, standing amidst a fountain of erupting river water inside the holiest sanctuary of the Fire People. For a second, they just stared at each other. The ruler of the upper world, and the father from the lower orders. "You," the great sun breathed, the divine mask slipping completely to reveal a terrified man. "You broke the seal." "No," Kian said, his voice calm amidst the chaos of the spraying water. "I just opened the door." He swung the club. The great sun raised his staff to block, but the force of Kian's blow shattered the ceremonial wood like a twig. The strike caught the ruler on the shoulder, sending him spinning backward, out through the great doorway and onto the visible platform in front of the thousands of screaming worshippers. Kian stepped out into the blinding light, the water flowing out of the temple around his ankles, turning the summit into a mudslide. The crowd below gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the valley. They saw their god-king sprawled in the mud, and standing over him, a figure that looked like he had been birthed from the earth itself. Kian looked for Talan. The boy hadn't moved. He was still standing at the edge, unbothered by the violence, unbothered by the toppled king. Talan turned slowly to look at his father. His eyes were completely black, no whites, no irises, just deep, endless pools of dark water. "Papa," Talan said, his voice carrying over the wind, clear and unnatural. "The river is here. It wants to climb the stairs." Kian looked down at the base of the mound. The fog had lifted, and the horror was revealed. The Mississippi had breached the banks. It wasn't a slow rise. A wall of water, brown and churning with debris, was tearing through the lower city, smashing the wattle and daub houses like toys. And riding the crest of the wave, moving against the current, were the great dugout canoes of the northern tribes, the enemies of Cahokia, the ones the Great Sun claimed to have banished. They hadn't come to trade. They had come because the river had opened a highway into the heart of the city. Elu broke free from the distracted guards and ran to Kian, grabbing his arm. "Kian, look at him! Look at Talan!" Kian looked back at his son. Talan raised his hands, and the water below seemed to surge in response, smashing into the base of the Monks Mound. The earth shook violently. The great pyramid built on the bones of the dead was beginning to liquefy. "We have to go," Kian yelled, grabbing Elu and reaching for Talan. "The mound is collapsing." "I can't go," Talan said, smiling a smile that wasn't his. "I am the anchor. If I leave, the water takes everything." The mud didn't just slide. It groaned. It was a sound like the earth itself was tearing a muscle, a deep, subterranean ripping noise that vibrated up through the soles of Kian's feet and settled in his teeth. He looked at the Great Sun, the man who had claimed to hold the leash of the cosmos, and watched as the fiction of his power dissolved. The ruler scrambled on all fours, his iridescent feather cape heavy with sludge, trying to climb the liquefying slope of the temple platform. But the mountain he had built was rejecting him. A fissure opened in the clay, a jagged, hungry mouth, and with a shriek that was swallowed instantly by the roar of the water, the brother of the sun slid backward into the darkness of the collapsing summit. He was gone, not ascended, not immortalized, just buried in the dirt he had forced others to carry. Kian didn't have time to process the death of a god. He turned to Talan. The boy was still standing rigid against the gale, his heels hovering over the abyss, his eyes voids of black water. The connection was terrifying. The boy raised a hand, and a massive section of the plaza wall far below exploded inward as the river rammed against it. It was as if Talan was conducting the destruction, an orchestra of mud and ruin. "Talan!" Elu screamed, her voice raw, cutting through the wind. She didn't reach for him with panic. She reached with a mother's terrifying precision. She grabbed his face, forcing those black, empty eyes to look at her. "Look at me, not the river. Look at me. I am the one who fed you. I am the one who named you. You are not the water." For a heartbeat, the boy's face remained a mask of stone. Then, a flicker. The blackness in his eyes receded for a fraction of a second, revealing the terrified brown iris of a 12-year-old boy beneath. "Mama," he gasped, the supernatural resonance vanishing from his voice, replaced by a small, broken whimper. "It's so cold. They're so loud." "Grab him," Kian roared, lunging forward. He wrapped his arms around his son's waist and heaved him away from the edge, just as the section of the temple where Talan had been standing sheared off and plummeted into the floodwaters below. They hit the mud together, a tangle of limbs and terror. "We can't go back down the tunnel," Kian shouted, spitting grit. "It's a geyser. We have to take the face. We have to slide." Elu looked over the edge of the platform. The Monks Mound was 100 feet high, a steep slope of packed clay that was rapidly turning into a landslide. Below, the city was a nightmare. The water was waist-deep in the Grand Plaza, a churning soup of debris, thatched roofs, and struggling bodies. And cutting through the water were the war canoes of the invaders. Kian could see them clearly now, men with shaved heads and chests painted in jagged white lines, striking down anyone who tried to climb onto the rooftops. They weren't just attacking, they were harvesting. They were pulling people into the boats, binding them. "It's death down there, Kian," Elu cried, clutching Talan, who was shivering violently in her arms. "It's death up here too," Kian said, pointing to the temple behind them. The great wooden structure groaned, its main beams snapping like dry twigs as the foundation shifted. The roof began to sag. "We ride the earth down. Stay low. Dig your heels in. Do not let go of the boy. He didn't wait for agreement. He grabbed Ilu's hand, she grabbed Talan, and they threw themselves over the edge of the terrace. It wasn't a slide, it was a chaotic, bruising tumble. The world became a blur of brown and gray. Kian felt the clay tearing at his skin, the friction burning his legs. He used the war club as a brake, digging the flint teeth into the mud to slow their descent. But the momentum was too great. They were debris now, just part of the avalanche. He saw rocks, broken pottery, and human bones, the ones that had been buried in the mound, surfacing around them, tumbling alongside them. The past was literally rising up to meet the present. They hit the first terrace with bone-jarring force. Kian rolled, absorbing the impact with his shoulder, hearing something pop. Pain flared white and hot, but he scrambled up, dragging Ilu and Talan with him. They were halfway down. The air here was thick with the copper smell of blood. The sounds of the slaughter below were distinct now. The thud of clubs, the splash of bodies falling, the guttural war cries of the northern tribes. They scrambled down the lower slope, sliding the last 20 feet into a pool of stagnant water that had collected at the base of the mound. The water was cold, shocking the breath out of them. Kian pulled them behind the wreckage of a granary that had floated against the earthwork. They huddled there, chest deep in the muck, gasping for air. "Is he breathing?" Kian whispered, looking at Talan. The boy was limp, his head lolling on Ilu's shoulder. His skin was pale, translucent almost, and the veins beneath looked dark, pulsing with a sluggish rhythm. Ilu touched his forehead and recoiled. "He's freezing, Kian. He's cold as river ice." "The connection," Kian muttered, wiping mud from his eyes. It drained him, or it's still draining him. He peeked around the edge of the granary. The scene before him was hellish. The Grand Plaza, once the center of order and commerce, was a killing field. The water was rising fast. The invaders had beached 2 large canoes near the chunky field and were dragging prisoners, priests judging by the white deerskin, toward them. But it wasn't just a raid. Kian watched as a warrior in a wolfskin cape drove a spear not into a person, but into the ground. He was shouting something at the sky, a chant that sounded like a challenge. "They aren't just looting," Kian realized, a cold dread settling in his stomach. "They're finishing the ritual. The Great Sun started it, but they are closing the circle. They want to drown the city completely. We need a boat," Ilu whispered, her teeth chattering. "We cannot outrun the water on foot." Kian looked at the canoes. They were heavily guarded. Impossible. He looked to the residential districts. The houses were disintegrating. The only things floating were logs and bloating corpses. Then he saw it. Drifted against the stockade wall, tangled in a mass of vines and debris, was a small, flat-bottomed skiff, a marsh hunter's boat. It was battered, half filled with water, but it was buoyant. "There," Kian pointed, 50 yards, through the water. "The water is open, Kian. They will see us," Ilu said, clutching Talan tighter. "If we stay here, the mound buries us. If we swim, we have a chance." Kian looked at his son. Talan's lips were turning blue. "He needs to get out of the water, Ilu. The river is trying to take him back." They moved. Kian took point, the war club raised, wading through the debris-choked water. It was slow, agonizing work. Every step was a gamble against hidden holes or submerged bodies. He kept his eyes on the invaders, timing their movements. They were distracted by the priests, taunting them before. Kian looked away. He couldn't save the priests. He could only save his world, which consisted of 2 people. They were halfway to the skiff when Talan woke up. He didn't wake up with a gasp. He woke up with a sound, a low, vibrating hum that emanated from his chest. The water around them stopped moving. The ripples ceased. The debris floating nearby, logs, baskets, a dead dog, froze in place. Kian stopped, the hair on his arm standing up. "Talan." The boy lifted his head. The eyes were brown again, but they were old. They looked tired. "They are calling the horned serpent," Talan whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "The men with the painted skulls. They are pouring blood into the water to call the guardian of the underworld. Let them call it." Kian hissed, grabbing Talan's arm. "We are leaving." "No, Papa," Talan said, and for the first time, he pulled away from Kian. "You don't understand. The serpent isn't coming for them. It's coming for me. I am the lure." Before Kian could react, the water 50 yards away, near the center of the plaza, began to boil. A massive shape broke the surface. Not a snake, but something far more ancient, covered in scales the color of wet slate, with spines running down its back like a saw blade. The invaders screamed, their chant turning into shrieks of panic as the creature smashed one of the war canoes into splinters with a lash of its tail. It was chaos, absolute primal chaos. The invaders turned their weapons on the beast, but their spears bounced off its hide. The beast roared, a sound that felt like a physical blow, and turned its head. It had huge, milky eyes, and they locked directly onto Kian, Elu, and Talan. "Run!" Kian screamed, shoving Elu toward the skiff. They splashed frantically through the water, the drag of the flood terrifyingly strong. Behind them, the sound of the beast tearing through the water was like a rushing waterfall. Kian threw Elu into the skiff and hauled Talan in after her. The boat rocked violently. Kian vaulted in, grabbing the single pole lying in the bottom. He jammed the pole into the mud and shoved. The skiff lurched forward, scraping against the stockade wall. "Faster!" Elu screamed, staring back. Kian pushed with every ounce of strength he had. The boat shot through a gap in the broken palisade, out of the plaza, and into the wider, deeper current of the overflowing creek that fed the river. He risked a glance back. The creature had stopped at the stockade wall. It wasn't pursuing. It was waiting, and standing on the head of the beast, balancing effortlessly on the scales, was a figure, small, slight, wearing a mask of a twisting catfish. The Shell Keeper. She raised a hand, pointing at them. Not in anger. She was pointing downriver. Why did she stop it? Elu gasped, clutching Talan to her chest. Kian collapsed onto the bench of the skiff, his chest heaving. The current caught them, sweeping them away from the dying city of Cahokia, carrying them into the gray, misty expanse of the floodwaters. "She didn't stop it," Talan said. He was looking at his own hands. Kian looked down. The veins in Talan's arms were no longer just dark. They were glowing with a faint, phosphorescent blue light. And where his fingernails used to be, small, sharp slivers of pearl were beginning to push through the skin. "She let us go," Talan whispered, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his mutating hands. "Because she knows I'm turning into one of them." Kian stared at his son's hands, the horror rising in his throat, choking him. The escape from the city wasn't the end. The city was just the cage. Now they were in the wild, and the wild was rewriting his son's DNA. Kian looked at the endless stretch of swollen river ahead. He realized then that he didn't have a destination. He didn't have a home. All he had was a boy who was becoming a monster, and a river that wouldn't stop until it had swallowed them whole. "Where are we going?" Elu asked, her voice breaking as she saw Talan's hands. Kian gripped the pole, his knuckles white. He looked south, toward the unknown swamps. "To the salt springs," Kian said, a desperate plan forming in the wreckage of his mind. Salt kills leeches. Maybe it kills magic too. The silence of the river was heavier than the screams of the dying city. Back in Cahokia, the air had been filled with the percussive violence of drums and breaking timber, but out here on the swollen Mississippi, the world was muffled in a thick, gray wool of fog. The only sound was the slap of black water against the hull of the stolen skiff and the ragged, wet breathing of 3 people who had no business being alive. Kian sat at the stern, the pole resting across his knees. His hands were raw, the blisters from the wood having burst and bled hours ago, now stinging with every splash of the muck-filled water. He didn't look at the blisters. He couldn't take his eyes off the boy curled in the bottom of the boat. Talan was wrapped in a sodden deer-hide blanket, but he wasn't shivering anymore. That was what terrified Kian the most. The boy had stopped shivering hours ago, despite the bone-deep chill of the river mist. Talan lay perfectly still, his eyes wide open, staring at the wooden planks of the hull as if he could see through them, down into the dark currents beneath. "He needs to eat," Elu whispered. She was sitting in the bow, her posture rigid, a flint knife clutched in her hand as she scanned the fog for movement. She looked older than she had at sunrise. The lines around her mouth were etched deep with a fear that no mother should ever have to feel. "We have no food," Kian replied, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, hollow, scraped dry. "We have the river water, but we dare not drink it. It's poisoned with the dead." "He doesn't need food," Talan said. The voice didn't sound like a 12-year-old boy. It sounded like stones grinding together underwater. Kian and Ilu froze. Talan sat up slowly, the blanket falling away from his shoulders. Kian felt bile rise in his throat. The mutation hadn't stopped. It had accelerated. The skin along Talan's neck and collarbone had taken on a pearlescent sheen, shimmering with faint blues and greens in the gloom. The scales were small, delicate, beautiful in a way that made Kian want to vomit. But it was the gills, 3 shallow, pulsing slits just below the boy's jawline, that broke Kian's heart. They fluttered rhythmically, tasting the damp air, searching for moisture. "Don't look at me like that, Papa," Talan whispered, pulling the blanket back up with hands that were becoming more claw than finger. "I can hear your heartbeat. It's too fast. You're afraid of me." "I am afraid for you," Kian lied, leaning forward to touch his son's knee. The skin felt slick, cold and hard. It felt like touching a fish that had just been pulled from the ice. "We are going to the salt springs. The elders used to say the salt purges the spirits. It dries out the rot. We will wash you in the brine, Talan. We will scrub this sickness off." Talan looked at the water over the side of the boat. "It's not a sickness. It's a memory. The river remembers what we used to be before we walked on land. It's just reminding me." As the sun began to set, turning the fog a bruised purple, the smell changed. The copper scent of blood and the rot of the flood gave way to something sharp, acrid and stinging, sulfur. And beneath that, the clean, mineral tang of salt. "Do you smell that?" Kian asked, his hope flaring like a spark in tinder. "The barren lands." Elu nodded, pointing ahead. The fog lifted slightly, revealing a landscape that looked like the skeleton of the world. The lush green forests of the river valley were gone. In their place was a desolate expanse of white-crusted earth. The trees here were dead, bleached white by the saline ground, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The floodwaters had encroached here too, but they didn't mix with the springs. There was a distinct line in the water, a boundary where the brown sludge of the Mississippi met the crystal-clear, bubbling blue of the salt springs. "Steer us in," Kian commanded, pushing the pole against the river bottom. "Into the clear water." As the skiff crossed the boundary, the boat hissed. The salt water was warm, heated by deep thermal vents. Talan gasped, arching his back, his hands gripping the gunnels. "It burns," the boy cried out, his voice returning to the high pitch of a child. "Papa, it burns." "That means it's working," Kian shouted, driving the boat onto a bank of white crystallized salt. "It's burning away the connection. Get him out." Kian and Ilu scrambled out of the boat, their sandals crunching on the salt crust. They grabbed Talan, who was thrashing now, his eyes rolling back in his head. They dragged him away from the boat toward a shallow pool of steaming hypersaline water. "Hold him down!" Kian yelled. He didn't want to do this. Every instinct screamed at him to comfort his child, not to torture him. But the scales on Talan's neck were pulsing violently, fighting the salt air. Kian plunged his hands into the hot spring, scooping up the brine, and began to scrub Talan's arms. Talan screamed. It was a sound that tore the twilight apart. Where the salt water touched the pearlescent scales, the skin hissed and smoked. The scales turned black and flaked off, revealing raw, red human skin beneath. It was brutal, it was agonizing, but it was working. "Hold him, Ilu," Kian begged, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat and the steam. "We have to finish it." Elu was weeping, pinning Talan's legs, whispering apologies into the salt-crusted earth. Kian scrubbed harder, moving to the boy's neck, to the gills. Talan thrashed with supernatural strength, throwing Kian back. The boy scrambled backward, curling into a ball, his skin a patchwork of burns and shimmering scales. "Stop," Talan wheezed, clutching his throat. "You're killing the voice. If the voice goes, I'm alone." "You are not alone," Kian roared, stepping forward. "We are here. We are your family." "No." Talan looked up, and for a moment Kian saw the boy he knew. The voice, it protects us. It tells me we are trespassing. Kian froze. The silence of the salt flats rushed back in. He looked around. The white landscape was still, dead, but then he saw it. On the ridge above the spring, standing perfectly motionless among the bleached trunks of the dead trees, were figures. They weren't soldiers of Cahokia. They weren't invaders from the north. They were naked, their skin pale and coated in a thick layer of white dried salt, making them look like statues carved from the landscape itself. They held no weapons, but their eyes were sewn shut with sinew. They didn't need eyes. They were listening. "The Salt Eaters," Elu whispered, the color draining from her face. "I thought they were a myth. The men who traded their sight for the Earth's secrets." One of the pale figures stepped forward. He opened his mouth and his teeth were filed into sharp points, stained black. He didn't speak to Kian. He tilted his head toward Talan, sniffing the air. "The boy smells of the deep river," the figure rasped, his voice like dry leaves. "But you are scrubbing him clean. Why do you destroy a gift that we have spent generations trying to find?" Kian stepped in front of his son, raising the war club. "He is not a gift. He is a boy, and we are leaving." The blind man smiled, cracking the dried salt on his face. "You cannot leave. The salt has already tasted your sweat. It knows you are here, and the salt is hungry, Potter. It demands a trade. The river takes the flesh, but the salt takes the mind." The figure raised a hand, and from the ground around them, the white crust began to crack. The ground beneath them didn't just crack, it inhaled. The white crust of the salt flats, which had felt as solid as stone moments ago, suddenly bowed inward, creating a concave depression that groaned under the weight of the sky. Kian felt his balance shift, the solid earth turning into a brittle skin over something hollow and hungry. He grabbed Elu's shoulder, pulling her back from the widening fissures, his boots sliding on the slick saline mud that bubbled up from the depths. The Salt Eaters stood their ground. They didn't sway. They didn't scramble. They simply adjusted their weight on their calloused, bare feet, vibrating in tune with the shifting landscape as if they were part of the tremor itself. The leader, the blind man with the filed teeth, tilted his head, his sewn-shut eyes fixed on Kian with terrifying precision. "The earth opens for the impure," the blind man whispered, his voice cutting through the hissing steam of the vents. "You bring a creature of the wet chaos into the house of the dry bone. Did you think the salt would not object?" "We just want passage," Kian shouted, though he knew it was useless. "We are leaving the valley." "There is no leaving," the blind man smiled, revealing gums stained black by the mineral chewing. "The water rises, the world drowns, only the salt remains. Give us the boy. We will preserve him. We will dry the river out of his veins and make him eternal." "Over my dead body," Kian snarled. "That is the arrangement." The blind man nodded. He raised a pale, dusted hand, and the circle of silent watchers moved. They didn't charge like the warriors of Cahokia, screaming and posturing. They flowed. They moved like sand sliding down a dune, silent, inevitable, and overwhelming. Kian swung the war club at the first figure that lunged from the mist. It was a perfect arc, aimed to crush the man's skull. But the figure ducked before the club even reached the apex of the swing. He moved as if he had heard Kian's muscles tense, as if the intention of violence made a sound louder than the violence itself. The man slammed a fist into Kian's ribs, a blow that felt like being hit with a bag of rocks. Kian stumbled back, gasping, the air driven from his lungs. These men were blind, but they could see the geometry of the fight better than Kian could. They lived in a world of vibration. Every heartbeat, every footfall, every sharp intake of breath was a beacon. "Elu!" Kian wheezed, dodging a sweeping kick from another cultist. "Make noise. Confuse them." Elu understood instantly. She didn't scream. She grabbed a handful of the loose salt crystals and hurled them into the boiling thermal pool next to her. The water erupted in a violent hiss of steam and splashing water. The sound was a cacophony of popping bubbles and scalding spray. The salt eaters flinched. The chaotic noise blinded them. They hesitated, their heads snapping toward the pool, their radar jammed by the white noise of the steam. "Now!" Kian roared. He didn't aim for their heads this time. He swept the club low, targeting their ankles. He connected. Bone shattered with a sickening crunch. The first cultist went down without a scream, just a sharp exhale of surprise. Kian spun, driving the flint edge of the club into the chest of the second attacker. But there were too many of them. They were swarming, not with anger, but with the cold efficiency of ants dismantling a beetle. Kian felt hands grabbing his tunic, fingers digging into his arms, trying to drag him down into the muck. He saw Elu backing away, dragging Talan behind her. Talan was limp, his skin raw and bleeding from Kian's attempt to scrub the scales off. "Papa!" Talan cried out, his voice thin and terrified. Kian broke free from the grapple with a feral snarl, head-butting the man holding him. He stumbled toward his family, slipping on the wet salt. "I'm coming!" Suddenly, the ground between Kian and Elu exploded. It wasn't the salt eaters. It was the thing beneath. A massive, translucent pincer, made of something that looked like crystallized quartz, burst through the crust. It was followed by a segmented body the size of a fallen oak tree. It was a grindstone made flesh, a giant burrowing crustacean that had lived in the hypersaline dark for eons. The salt eaters fell back, prostrating themselves on the sharp ground. "The mother rises," they chanted in a ragged unison. "She comes to taste." The creature didn't have eyes. It had feelers, long whipping antennae that lashed the air. One of them struck Kian, sending him flying backward into a drift of salt. The breath left him again, and his vision swam. He looked up, dazed, to see the creature towering over Elu and Talan. Its mandibles clicked, dripping a thick, caustic slime that sizzled where it hit the ground. Elu stood before the beast, holding the small flint knife. It was a needle against a mountain. She was going to die. Kian tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body was broken, exhausted beyond the limit of human endurance. "No," Kian whispered, clawing at the salt. Then Talan moved. The boy didn't run. He didn't hide behind his mother. He stepped forward, pushing Elu's hand down. He looked at the giant crystalline monster. Talan's skin was still burned, the red, raw flesh exposed, but the gills on his neck flared wide. He took a deep breath, not of air, but of the heavy, sulfurous atmosphere. Talan screamed. But it wasn't a human scream. It was the same sound the river had made, the same sound the horned serpent had answered to. It was a frequency that vibrated in the liquid of the inner ear, a resonance that shattered equilibrium. But here, in the dry, brittle world of the barren lands, the sound didn't call water. It shattered crystal. The sound wave hit the quartz beast like a physical hammer. The creature shrieked, a high, piercing sound of agony. Cracks appeared on its translucent shell. Spiderwebs of fractures raced across its armored plating. Talan didn't stop. He poured every ounce of his pain, his fear, and his mutated power into that note. Crack! The creature's pincer exploded into a shower of sharp shards. It recoiled, thrashing blindly, unable to process the frequency that was unmaking its very structure. The salt eaters covered their ears that had been tuned to the subtle shifts of the earth, and screamed as their eardrums ruptured. They fell to the ground, writhing in the salt, their advantage turned into their destruction. "Elu, the ravine!" Kian shouted, forcing himself up despite the agony in his ribs. The creature, blinded and broken, thrashed backward, collapsing into the hole it had emerged from, taking the shelf of ground with it. A chasm opened up, separating the salt eaters from the small family. Kian grabbed Talan. The boy was sagging, his eyes rolling back, blood trickling from his nose and his gills. He was burning up, radiating heat like a kiln. "We have to move before they recover," Kian gasped, pulling Elu along. They ran. They ran until the white crust of the salt flats gave way to the gray, dead soil of the transition zone. They ran until the smell of sulfur faded, replaced by the scent of wet ash and pine. They scrambled up a rocky ridge, putting miles between them and the white hell they had just escaped. They collapsed in a small hollow beneath the roots of a massive, overturned cypress tree. The rain had started, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked them to the bone. Kian leaned back against the wood, his chest heaving. He looked at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. He looked at Elu. She was staring at Talan, wiping the blood from his face with the hem of her ruined dress. "He saved us," Elu whispered, her voice trembling. "Kian, did you see that? He broke the stone with his voice." Kian looked at his son. Talan was unconscious again, but something had changed. The scrubbing with the brine hadn't cured him. It had done something worse. The raw patches where Kian had tried to scour away the scales were healing before his eyes. But they weren't healing as human skin. They were healing as something harder. The scales were returning, but they were darker now, thicker, armor, and the gills. The gills were no longer just slits. They were fully formed, fringed with delicate red filaments that twitched in the damp air. "We didn't cure him," Kian said, his voice hollow with realization. "The salt, it stripped away the weak parts. It stripped away the human parts. We just made the monster stronger." Elu touched Talan's cheek. "He is not a monster, Kian. He is our son." "Is he?" Kian asked, looking at the boy's hands. The fingers were longer now, the webbing between them thick and gray. "Look at him, Elu. He belongs to the river now. Or the river belongs to him. I don't know which is worse. He defended us," Elu insisted, her eyes fierce. "He chose us. The river didn't tell him to do that. He did it because he loves you." Kian closed his eyes. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the soul of his boy was still in there, driving the mutating flesh. But he remembered the look in Talan's eyes right before he screamed. It wasn't love. It was command. It was the look of a king dismissing a subject. "We need to rest," Kian said, ending the argument because he didn't have the strength to win it. "We'll take turns watching. The salt eaters won't follow us off the flats. They are bound to the ground." "And the river?" Elu asked, looking out at the dark, flooded valley below them. "The river is everywhere," Kian muttered. Night fell, thick and impenetrable. Kian took the first watch. He sat with the war club across his knees, listening to the rain dripping through the dead branches. He thought about his workshop in Cahokia. He thought about the smell of drying clay. He thought about the simple, structured life he had lost. He realized now that he had been mourning that life since the moment he kicked in his own door. But mourning was a luxury. Survival was a job. Around midnight, the rain stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the empty silence of the salt flats. It was a pregnant silence, heavy with intent. Kian shifted, his senses on high alert. He heard a snap, a twig breaking, not from the direction of the salt flats, but from the ridge above them. He nudged Elu awake with his foot. She sat up instantly, knife in hand. "Someone is here," Kian mouthed. They waited. The darkness seemed to press in. Then, a voice drifted down from the darkness. It wasn't the rasp of a salt eater, nor the guttural dialect of the northern invaders. It was the clipped, arrogant tone of the Cahokian elite. "You run well for a potter," the voice said. A torch flared to life on the ridge, then another, then a dozen. The light spilled down into the hollow, illuminating Kian and Elu. Standing above them, looking pristine despite the mud and the chaos of the last 2 days, was the high priest of the Red Cedar, the Sun Brothers' second in command. And flanking him were 20 members of the Birdman Guard, their copper breastplates gleaming in the firelight, their bows drawn and aimed directly at Kian's chest. "The great sun is dead," the priest said, descending the slope with casual grace. "The city is broken. The fire is out." He stopped 10 paces away, smiling a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "But a new fire must be lit, and we need the spark." He pointed a finger, not at Kian, but at the sleeping form of Talan. "Wake the god," the priest commanded. We have a new empire to build, and he is going to be the cornerstone." Kian stood up, stepping in front of his son. He was tired. He was hurt. He was outnumbered 20-1. But as he gripped the war club, he felt a strange calm settle over him. It was the calm of a man who has nothing left to lose but his life and finds the price cheap. "You want him?" Kian asked, his voice low and dangerous. "We own him," the priest corrected. "Then come and take him." Kian braced himself for the volley of arrows. He watched the archers tighten their fingers on the strings. He took a breath, preparing to die. But the arrows didn't fly, because behind Kian, in the shadows of the tree roots, Talan stood up. He didn't look at his father. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at the priest, and for the first time Talan spoke not with the voice of a boy or the voice of a river, but with a voice that sounded like many voices speaking in unison, a chorus of the drowned. "You do not build on water," Talan said, stepping into the torchlight. "You sink." And then the torches went out, not blown out by wind. They were extinguished. The fire simply ceased to exist, sucked away into the damp air. Pitch blackness engulfed them. "What is this?" the priest screamed in the dark. "The bottom," Talan whispered. And then the screaming started. It wasn't the screams of men fighting. It was the screams of men drowning on dry land. Kian heard the wet gurgle of lungs filling with fluid, the thrashing of bodies against the earth as if they were caught in a riptide. "Don't move," Kian told Ilu, grabbing her hand in the absolute dark. "Don't move." They stood there, listening to the elite guard of Cahokia drown in the open air, killed by the ocean that Talan had summoned into their very chests. The boy wasn't just controlling the river anymore. He was becoming the atmosphere. And Kian realized, with a terror that froze his blood, that he wasn't protecting his son from the world. He was protecting the world from his son. The silence that followed the screaming was worse than the screaming itself. In the absolute darkness of the hollow, Kian listened to the sound of 20 men dying without being touched. There was no clash of weapons, no struggle of bodies against bodies. There was only the wet, rattling gasp of lungs trying to inhale air and finding only fluid. It was the sound of drowning, unmistakable and visceral, but it was happening in a dry forest, miles from the river. Then, one by one, the gasping stopped. The silence returned, heavy and finalized, broken only by the soft, rhythmic dripping of the rain from the cypress needles. "Talan," Elu whispered into the black void. Her voice was trembling, terrified not of the soldiers, but of the answer. There was a snap of fingers, a sound sharp and crisp like a breaking bone, and the torches that had been extinguished flared back to life. But they didn't burn orange. They burned with a cold blue luminescence, casting long spectral shadows across the hollow. Kian blinked, his eyes adjusting to the unnatural light, and looked at the scene before him. The high priest of the Red Cedar and his elite birdman guard were dead. They lay scattered across the slope in twisted heaps. Their bodies were unmarked. No blood, no bruises, no arrows. But their chests were distended, swollen tight against their copper breastplates, and water, muddy river water, trickled from their open mouths and noses. They had drowned from the inside out. The boy had simply commanded the water in their own blood to turn against them, to become the river. Talan stood in the center of the carnage. He looked taller. His posture had lost the awkward slump of adolescence. He stood with the stillness of a heron waiting to strike. The blue torchlight danced off his skin, which was no longer just copper. It was patterned with whirls of iridescent gray and slate, like the surface of a deep pool. He turned to look at his parents. The gills on his neck flared, tasting the air, and his eyes were entirely black now, reflecting the dead men around him without an ounce of pity. "They were loud," Talan said. His voice was calm, stripped of any tremble. "They wanted to put me in a cage. The river doesn't like cages." Kian stepped forward, the war club slipping from his numb fingers. He wanted to rush to his son, to shake him, to wake him up from this nightmare, but his feet felt leaden. He looked at the boy he had raised, the boy he had taught to shape clay, to fish, to respect the spirits, and he saw a stranger wearing his son's face. "What have you done?" Kian whispered. "I finished it," Talan replied, tilting his head as if listening to a distant sound. "Can you hear it, Papa? The main channel. It's calling. It's time to go back." "No," Kian said, finding his voice. "We are going south, to the tribes of the Delta. We will find a healer. We will find someone who can undo this." Talan smiled, and it was a terrible thing to witness. It was a smile of pity. "You cannot heal the butterfly back into the caterpillar, Papa. The shell is broken. This is what I am now. I won't let you go," Kian said, his voice cracking. He moved to grab Talan's arm, but Elu stepped in front of him. She placed a hand on Kian's chest, stopping him. Kian looked down at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Talan with a profound, heartbreaking acceptance. Mothers know things fathers refuse to see. She knew the moment Talan had stood up on the ridge that her son was gone. "Kian," she said softly, "look at his skin. Look at his gills. If we keep him on land, he will die. He is suffocating in the air." Kian looked. He saw the way Talan's chest heaved with labored, shallow breaths. He saw the dryness cracking the edges of the beautiful, terrifying scales. The boy was amphibious, but the balance was tipping. The land was rejecting him. "He is my son," Kian choked out, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "I am your son," Talan said, stepping closer. He reached out and took Kian's hand. His touch was ice-cold, wet, and powerful. "But I am also the flood. You cannot keep the flood in a jar, Papa. If you try, I will break the jar. I will break everything." The journey to the riverbank was a funeral procession of 3. They walked through the flooded forest, the water rising from ankle-deep to knee-deep. Kian walked in a daze, his mind replaying every memory of Talan. The first time he walked, the first pot he threw on the wheel, the way he used to laugh when the dogs chased the turkeys. He was trying to catalogue a life that was ending. They reached the edge of the Mississippi just as the sun began to bleed gray light into the eastern sky. The river was monstrous. It was miles wide, a churning, violent brown ocean that carried whole trees, dead bison, and the wreckage of Cahokia south toward the sea. The sound was deafening, a constant roaring thunder that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. Talan walked to the edge of the bank. The water lapped at his toes, and instantly, the tension left his body. He sighed, a sound of pure relief. The scales on his back shimmered, deepening in color, matching the turbulent current. He turned to face them one last time. "You must build a boat," Talan said, pointing to a grove of sturdy cypress trees nearby. "A strong one, not for the shallows, for the deep water." "We have a boat," Kian said, gesturing vaguely back toward the salt flats. "That was a shell." Talan shook his head. "You need a vessel that can ride the spine of the serpent, because you are leaving." "Where are we going?" Elu asked, stepping forward to brush a lock of wet hair from Talan's forehead. Her hand lingered there, memorizing the feel of him. "South," Talan said. "Far south, past the delta, past the swamps, to the place where the river drinks the salt of the great sea. You will be safe there. The water will know you." "And you?" Kian asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the river. "Where will you go?" Talan looked out at the water. The violence of the current seemed to calm where his gaze fell. "I stay. The mound is broken. The balance is gone. The river needs a new keeper. It needs someone to tell it when to sleep and when to wake." "You are a child," Kian sobbed, finally breaking. He fell to his knees in the mud. "You are just a boy. You cannot be a god. It is too lonely." Talan knelt in front of him. He didn't hug Kian. He placed his webbed hands on Kian's shoulders and looked him in the eye. "I won't be lonely, Papa. I have the voices of the drowned. I have the songs of the deep fish. And I have the memory of you." He leaned in, his shark-like eyes softening for a brief, human second. "You shaped the clay, Papa. You taught me that the clay has a will of its own. You just help it find its form. Well, I have found my form." Talan stood up. He looked at Elu. "Mama, don't look back." Elu nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't look away. She stood tall, a warrior witnessing a sacrifice. Go, she whispered. Talan turned and stepped into the river. He didn't swim. He walked. The water swirled around his waist, then his chest, then his neck. He didn't struggle against the crushing current. He merged with it. For a moment, Kian thought he saw the boy submerge, lost forever. But then, the water exploded. From the depths of the Mississippi, a shape rose. It wasn't a boy anymore. It was a figure of water and light, massive and fluid, a towering construct of liquid that held the vague, shimmering outline of a human. The river god rose 20 feet into the air, looking down at the two small figures on the bank. The face was featureless, yet Kian knew it was smiling. The giant watery hand raised, and the chaotic churning current of the river suddenly parted. A lane of calm, glass-smooth water opened up, stretching south as far as the eye could see. It was a highway through the chaos, a path of safety carved specifically for them. Kian stood up. He felt empty, hollowed out, like a pot before the firing. But he also felt a strange, resonant pride. He had tried to save his son from the world, but his son had become the world. He took Ilu's hand. "We have to build the boat," he said, his voice rough. "Yes," Ilu replied, her eyes fixed on the towering figure dissolving back into the mist. "We have a long way to go." They worked for 3 days, fueled by grief and adrenaline. They felled a cypress, hollowed it out with fire and flint, and shaped it with the skills of a master craftsman. When the canoe was finished, it was sleek, strong, and balanced. They pushed it into the calm lane of water that Talan had left for them. They drifted south. The journey took weeks. They passed destroyed villages, bloated carcasses, and bands of desperate survivors. But nothing touched them. The river protected them. When storms raged, the water around their boat remained calm. When alligators approached, they turned away as if commanded by an unseen voice. They eventually reached the Great Delta, where the river fractured into 1,000 veins before bleeding into the sea. They found a high hammock of land, rich with soil and clay, and there they built a house. Not a house of poles and thatch like in Cahokia, but a house of sturdy earth and driftwood. Kian went back to his wheel. He dug the clay from the riverbank, the clay that felt like his son's skin, and he began to shape it. He didn't make grain jars or water jugs anymore. He made effigies. He made statues of a boy with gills, standing on the back of a horned serpent. He fired them in a kiln built from the river mud. Years passed. Kian's hair turned white. Ilu's hands grew stiff with age. They lived quietly, the grandparents of a legend that was already spreading north. Traders would stop at their landing, bringing copper and shells, and they would tell stories in hushed tones. They spoke of the blue god who ruled the upper river. They spoke of the underwater city beneath the ruins of Cahokia, where the fish swam through the windows of the sunken temples. They said the river was no longer angry, just watchful. They said that if you looked into the water at twilight, you could see eyes staring back, eyes that were black and ancient, but held a flicker of human memory. One evening, Kian sat by the water's edge, washing the clay from his hands. The sun was setting, painting the gulf in shades of violet and gold. He was old now, his movements slow. Elu had passed the winter before, returning to the earth she loved. Kian was alone, waiting. He looked at the water. "Are you there?" he whispered. The surface of the river didn't ripple. There was no wind, but a small, perfect white shell washed up onto the mud, right at Kian's feet. It wasn't a seashell. It was a freshwater mussel shell, of the kind that only grew 1,000 miles north, in the shadow of the great mounds. Kian picked it up. He smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. He rubbed his thumb over the pearlescent interior. "I know," he said to the river. "I miss you too." He put the shell in his pocket and turned back to his kiln. The fire was dying down, but the embers were still hot. There was always more clay to shape. There was always a new story to tell. And as long as the river flowed, Kian knew that he was never truly alone. The water held the memory of everything it touched, and he had touched the water's heart. Stand on the banks of the Mississippi today, where the industrial barges churn the mud and the levees hold back the weight of the continent. Close your eyes and listen past the hum of the diesel engines. Listen to the slap of the water against the concrete. Some say it's just physics, just gravity pulling water to the sea. But the locals, the ones who have lived in the shadow of the water for generations, know better. They know that the river watches. They know that sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the moon is hidden, you can see a ripple that moves against the current, a shape that looks like a boy swimming home. And if you drop a stone into the depths, you aren't just disturbing the water, you are knocking on a door. And somewhere, in the cold, dark silence of the deep channel, something is listening, waiting for the day the levees break and the family can be together again.